momentum. They like where their momentum's heading. They would love an additional quarter to play. Atkins carving into the space, throwing his receiver open, and Carrico slams the door on Colorado's comeback.
It feels like the wind chill could throw the knockout punch here. Dylan DeClercq trying to do just that. Brandon Mattis to the end zone, rips it down for Minnesota.
I believe that's Ryan, who throws a Callahan. What a play by Jack Williams with the...
La marque un double sur Grou. Oh là, bon, ça a été bloqué par la main, c'est le numéro 42, là. Grou qui allait pour une passe longue, c'est Jasper Tom qui bloque ça. Le Breeze qui menace, 54 secondes, à moins de 20 verges, du point égalisateur, Jurek. Il va trouver son coéquipier. Voilà le point égalisateur du Breeze. C'est 20-20 avec 47 secondes à faire.
Welcome back. It's Swing Pass. I'm Adam Ruffner. That's Cameron Brock. Chaos season continues unabated. A weekend full of wild results and comebacks. Colorado not faring well in its Central Division 2-game road trip doubleheader through Madison and Minnesota, dropping both of their matchups against the Radicals and Wind Chill. The Summit now at 2-5, sitting in 5th place in the West Division, looking way up at the playoff seeding out there. Meanwhile, Madison improves to 5-2. They're at 2nd place in the Central Division. Minnesota, the reigning division champs, improved to 5-1. Elsewhere, Pittsburgh, New York, and DC all orchestrate crucial late game comebacks as they all push towards their postseason hopes. Cameron, we have just 5 weeks remaining in the 2024 UFA calendar, and while there were 12 games worth of results in Week 8, maybe half of them were interesting in one way or another, but all of them sort of contribute as we're now running fully downhill towards the last bit of this regular season schedule.
Yeah, and it's crazy because usually at this point in the schedule, I feel like we have a pretty good grasp on who's making the playoffs. We might have a division or two that might have a 4th team that seems to be hanging around. And, you know, in the East, it looks pretty set. The South, probably set in terms of which teams make the playoffs. But, I mean, in the Central, it's everyone but Detroit. I mean, everyone's hat's in the ring right now. In the West, we still have 5 teams alive, though, as you mentioned with Colorado's 2 losses this weekend, they are critically on life support right now. Their playoff hopes are barely existent at this point. A lot of things have to go right. But still, even you take Colorado out of the equation, there are 4 teams fighting for those, 4 more teams fighting for those spots. And not necessarily the 4 that maybe we would have thought at the beginning of the season either, which is maybe the crazier part of it.
I mean, it really gets to the parity of this 2024 season to talk about this current playoff picture, because if the postseason was to start today, there would be 4 teams, a full third of the playoff bracket, that were not in playoff contention last year. That would be Madison and Pittsburgh in the Central, and Seattle and Oakland out west. East and South have relatively gone to chalk, and what we would expect in the top 3 seeds, even if it's not the particular order that we would have maybe sorted at the beginning of this season, but a little bit more of the expected results in the East and South, while in the Central and West, it's been total chaos.
Yeah, something I was talking over the weekend, just kind of looking at the results. Pittsburgh now, for instance, a team that was, finished 4th in the division last year, missed the playoffs. They have 4 wins right now, and those 4 wins are against 4 different Central Division opponents. The only team they haven't beat in division so far is Madison. The last time Pittsburgh beat every team in the Central during the season was in 2019, when they made it to the division championship game. We're 1 win away from championship weekend. So they've had a little bit of a resurgence after having several years where they've really struggled against the teams at the top of that division. They found ways to win games, and we're seeing Seattle, having an amazing season, and they're just 1 win away from guaranteeing a playoff spot. It's crazy. Some of the turnarounds that we've seen this year, not just in certain games, but even just entire franchises really taking big leaps forward for where they've been over the past couple of seasons.
Well, speaking of turnarounds, let's start with the Friday night game of the week matchup where Colorado traveled to face Madison at Breeze Stevens Field. I got the honor of being able to call that alongside Colin Camp on the broadcast. That was one of the more thrilling games I can remember over the past few seasons at Breeze, and maybe it's because the home team finally got the edge, but there was just something about that interdivisional, I don't know what it is, mojo that happens where you get a new opponent. It's a first ever meeting. You're just kind of waiting to see how these teams are going to clash against each other. And I've got to say, I wasn't expecting this high scoring sort of shootout that it became with the Radicals persevering 24-22. But I'm very glad that it amounted to what happened in the waning moments of regulation, with Colorado engineering a fantastic fourth quarter comeback, seemingly almost tying it with Alex Atkins shooting it into the end zone for Chance Cochran, but Jake Carrico getting the final block, and then the ensuing fast break score to Pierre Robert, who is kind of the star of the night for the Radicals. The rookie and Hodag captain really shining in his last two home games. But this was a total team win for Madison. And I think that might be the most encouraging development for them. You know, we've kind of, both through coverage and in just strategy, talked about Anthony Gutowski and Kai Marcus as being two of the more important pieces of Madison's successes the past two seasons. Kai Marcus missed last year with an injury. Gutowski was a rookie sensation. This year, they're both fully healthy. They contributed majorly. But against Colorado, they were kind of a little bit either non-factors in Gutowski or in Marcus's case, really turnover prone. And so much of what Madison did correctly kind of flowed out of the system and the structure on both offense and defense everywhere else. And it's been a long time since I can remember, maybe even years, that Madison has had this kind of quality win over a quality opponent without it necessitating some kind of star performance from one of their guys.
Yeah, Kai Marcus, 7 throwaways in the game. Half of the Madison turnovers.
I've got to say, one of my favorite moments from the night was he was at throwaway number 6, and Colin Camp was talking on the mic on the broadcast at the time, and he was saying verbatim, I don't know if Kai Marcus will have another opportunity at a deep shot. And he had to cut himself off and say, just kidding, because Marcus was already unloading another huck that resulted in a turnover.
Yeah. The Madison offense, last year, even the year before, because Kai Marcus in 2022 only got a couple games in before he got hurt. Not known for a lot of hucks. They threw 16 in this game. And, they were 10 for 16. 63% is not the worst huck percentage in the world. It's not really what you're aiming for. But on the other side, Colorado was only 5 out of 10. So they're only 50%. This was a really weird game in the way it played out. I much like you, I expected this to be lower scoring. In particular, if Madison was going to win, I expected it to be lower scoring. Madison put up 15 goals in the first half. And that just blew my mind because Madison's had so many struggles offensively, basically since 2018. They've not been able to get a consistent offense together. And for them to explode for 15 goals in a half against a Colorado team that, despite their struggles in the win column, we still firmly believe they have so many good defensive pieces. I just didn't even know where to begin, about what was happening. And for them to have so much success in the deep game, 10 completed hucks, that seemed, we talked about it in the, before the weekend, how are they going to get a deep game going? Well, what do I know? Apparently getting a deep game going wasn't necessarily the problem at all. If anything, the problems we saw are the things like Kai Marcus having 7 turnovers. That's not something that's sustainable. It worked in this game. But I mean, credit to Madison because they punched Colorado in the face early. And if it wasn't for a very silly foul as time expired or was about to expire in the first quarter, they would have been up 7-5 going into the second quarter. And then they outscored Colorado by 4 in the second quarter. I mean, this was just so beyond my expectations for how this game was going to go that I just spent the whole game kind of in awe of what was happening, and kind of like Colin Camp's statement, I found myself having thoughts about what I thought was going to happen or how I thought the game was going to turn out, and I would have to stop mid-thought because it wasn't going at all how I pictured.
And to your point about sustainability, yes, some of the questionable decision making on the offense will probably have to get refined. But I'll tell you what has returned for Madison has been a big part of their successes in getting to 5-2 at this point in their schedule. The defense has returned. And while it's different from the vaunted Radicals defenses of yesteryear and kind of what established them on a perennial championship weekend appearance basis and led to their 2018 title, right now, statistically, it is the number one unit in the league. The Radicals lead the UFA in break rate, blocks per game, and break scores per game. And they're also top 5 in defensive success rate, meaning that, break rate is sort of the raw amount that your defense has success against an opposing offense. Defensive efficiency or success rate is how efficient you are in converting the exact amount of possessions you get. And so kind of no matter how you slice it, this Radicals defense is performing at absolute optimum levels. And against Colorado, it was much of the same. They were 9 of 11, 82% on their defensive break opportunities. They have double-digit blocks now in all 7 of their games so far. Again, they lead the league in takeaways per game. And there's just not really a prime time player who is responsible for it. Again, in years past, it was kind of Peter Graffi, Andrew Meshnick, Kevin Pettit-Scantling, these guys you could kind of rely on. Sterling Kanaki, there was Kanaki Island there when he first came into the league. There was sort of these big block getters that pace the upfront effort of a very strong unit for Madison. There are still a lot of takeaways, but it's kind of coming from all 7 players on the unit. And what's really manifested differently in 2024 over almost any other version of this Radicals defense, the fast break, quick twitch ability for them to get in transition and find these scores while the opposing offense is still struggling to get any sort of coverage going is really evident. And this is where I want to bring in the case of Pierre Robert, the Radicals' sort of breakout rookie this season. He finished against Colorado with an assist, 7 goals, and a block, and 332 total yards without a turnover while playing almost all of his points on defense. And I mean, he began the game with a break score that was crucial. He was the person reeling in the final score as basically time expired in regulation, and the entirety of the Breeze Stevens fan section went absolutely bonkers. He's just kind of been a big talisman and representative for the larger team successes that Madison is experiencing so far.
Another big thing, I think, is the development of Jake Carrico.
He's been fantastic.
Yeah, it's his 3rd year with the team. First year only played 3 games. Last year got into 9 games and had 10 blocks in those 9 games. I mean, anytime you have a player who can average more than a block a game, that's something special. There aren't a ton of guys that can play, 9 or so games in a season and average a block per game. And this year he's at 9 blocks already through 6 games played. He's been amazing for them. Really from week 1. In week 1, he led them in plus minus from the D line. Like you don't see that. Like you just mentioned Pierre and Robert, but like typically your plus minus leaders are your offensive players, as they obviously get more chances to throw goals and catch them as well. He's been great for them this year, and he's been the spark plug on defense that I think like Jacob Reuben Miller was in his first year, when he was kind of so many times it felt like he was getting the block and then finishing off the point by getting bookends and scoring. I kind of feel like that's where Jake Carrico has been this year. And as you mentioned before, he was the one who got that final block that basically, that sealed the game up for Madison. His elevated play, I think, is a big part of why their defense has been so much better. But also, like you said, like the blocks, he did have 3 of those blocks out of their 11. But I mean, getting double-digit blocks against this Colorado team, and I know they were down Nethercutt and they were down a couple other defensive players, and that forces some lineup shuffling. I get all that, but the fact that they were able to generate those turnovers through blocks is a really good sign, because you're not always going to be able to rely on a team to just throw the disc away. And Madison didn't really do that. Like, they forced 16 turnovers, and 11 of them were from them actually going and getting a block. And that speaks to a defense that's performing well rather than just relying on its opponent to make mistakes. And kudos to them, because this is a complete turnaround from what we saw last year, where they just couldn't find their footing in games all the time, especially when it came to the end. They've still had some end of quarter things that need cleaned up, but they've really taken a huge leap forward from where they were last year. And they you don't want to say they're back, because before this slump, they were, one of the top teams in the league year in, year out, but they're definitely building towards something that when they've been stagnant, kind of, and almost stuck in the mud these last few years.
Well, and they're a perfect juxtaposition in terms of strength of schedule to Colorado. They have inverse records at this point. Madison is 5-2, Colorado is 2-5. And to that point, Madison has got to build its confidence in the beginning half of its schedule against lesser competition, so that they can work these newer players and kind of unproven aspects of their lineups into bigger roles. And I think that that's really benefited them. Where on the flip side, you have this Summit team, and all they've done is basically face playoff level competition through their first 7 games of 2024. And they've never really been able to get on track, whether it be because of roster absences or offensive line shuffling, or never really having a sense of who's going to play what where. It's just been sort of the shuffle show for this Summit team.
Yeah, I mean, and to kind of be a little bit more direct about the schedule, 3 of their wins right now are against Detroit.
Madison, that is.
Yeah, Madison's. And their first win of the season, their first game of the season was at Pittsburgh, who has been playing better lately, but Pittsburgh's first 3 games of the season, they looked like one of the bottom 5 or 6 teams in the league. Their defense was Swiss cheese. Their offense wasn't able to really get anything going in any of those games. So like, that Pittsburgh team they faced is not the same team we've seen that's won 4 games in a row. Or I guess not 4 in a row, sorry, 4 of their last 5. And so it really was kind of like, how good is this team? They didn't look great against Minnesota. They lost at Chicago, and we've seen, and we'll get to it, but like, Chicago's really kind of struggling right now as well. So this was a game to me that kind of, I was looking to this game for Madison to show me something. Like, show me who you really are. Like, show me what you're capable of. And they showed all of us. I mean, they put on quite a show. And despite Colorado's record, I don't think any of us look at Colorado as a team that's like not a good win for you. Like, if you beat Colorado, you're doing something right. I know the records shows that they're 2-5, but as you mentioned, those losses are against teams that, I mean, we don't really know about Madison because it's a melee in the Central, but every other team they've lost to is probably making the playoffs. I mean, they're not losing to bad teams. And some of those losses, kind of like this Madison one, have been close. It's not like they're getting blown out either, other than the one Salt Lake game.
Yeah, I mean, I've just been really impressed with Madison's ability to kind of find its confidence again, despite having a few setbacks. And then the flip side, I've been impressed by Colorado. I know they sit at 2-5, but even in some of their losses, I mean, their greatest loss of the season was by 5 against Salt Lake, but they only lost to Atlanta by 2. They hung around until the very late stages of this game against Madison. And then the following night in Minnesota, they made a game out of it too in the second half, just sort of steadily clawing back, never really allowing themselves to compound on mistakes. We'll talk about kind of the comebacks elsewhere in the league in week 8, where certain teams allowed mistakes to just pile up on them. This Colorado team, for all their faults, they have a good ability to sort of stitch it together when it matters and sort of get that backbone behind them so that they're not just coming apart at the seams.
Yeah, and Alex Atkins played 33 points in that game or something crazy, like the
Career high 33 points, 7 assists, 2 goals, 2 blocks. He completed 67 throws, had over 700 yards of total offense.
It's really a shame because he did have 3 throwaways, but considering he threw the disc 70 times and was basically being asked to, it kind of feels like he's being asked to carry the offense on his shoulders. And I don't know if that's by design or if that's just how it ends up playing out in the game.
I think it was due to the lineup absences this weekend in particular. And we'll get into his overall week 8 sort of human efforts, I think, after we get to the Minnesota game.
Yeah. It's just really unfortunate that the Madison game had to end with, like, he basically played as well as you could possibly even hope for him to play. And that shot just didn't need to happen. They had 20 seconds still left. Like, there was an easier, better shot that probably could have presented itself. At the very least, you can get a similar looking shot when you get closer. But man, when you've played 33 points and you've just been carrying the entire offensive load the whole time, it's not going to be the easiest to try to, like, make the pinpoint best decision in that situation. So, like, I really felt for him. You even saw he was the one who kind of went back on the deep shot.
He almost got the block. He almost got the block on the second to last throw of the game, basically.
Yeah. And he, after he doesn't get it, he just stays on the ground, and it's just like, yeah, man, you earned it. You lay there because, like, you've done as much as anyone could, like, really ask of you in this game. And I don't think this was why he was doing it. Like, for all intents and purposes, like, it looks like he does not have any animosity about the fact, like, that he's being asked to, like, do so much he has to. Like, he still looks like he's out there having a good time with his teammates, and, like, he looks like a guy you want on the line with you, like, even in situations where things are going poorly. But it just looked like that's what pure exhaustion looks like. That's what it looks like when you've given every ounce of everything you have inside of you to try to win a game, and it just doesn't quite turn out how you want it to. And I mean, kudos to him, though. And then he had to go play another game the next day, like 33 points, and then 24 hours later, a couple hundred miles later, you're asked to do it all over again.
So let's move on to the other big Central Division matchup for the Summit. They fall 24-22 against Madison on Friday. They've got to pack up, schlep even further north up to the land of 10,000 lakes, face off against the wind chill at Seafoam Stadium. And it is a torrential downpour. It's been storming all day there. Basically, the most adverse conditions for a team traveling to have to try to get up for that environment in the second game in as many days. And yet, again, Colorado fought really valiantly on the road in Minnesota. They just could never quite get over the hump of the early lead that the wind chill established. Minnesota takes a 20-17 win. Minnesota now has 3 straight games with 52% or better offensive efficiency. That is a great number to be trending upward for a wind chill team that, even though they've made 3 straight divisional championship game appearances, the offense's ability to stay consistent and in rhythm is one of the things that continually dogs wind chill's greater hopes of playoff and postseason success. And yet in this game, despite all the weather, they had just 18 turns. The offense was continually able to get scores when it matters most. I remember, I think most crucially, there was that point in the second half when Minnesota called a timeout. They get a set play on the field, and it's Josh Klain getting a called look for Matt Rader just all on his own in the end zone. And that sort of simple 1-2 connection is the kind of thing that I love to see from Minnesota. So great effort there. And the most surprising thing for me in this particular game, given that it was raining, given that's an opponent that has kind of typically been pretty good against defending the Huck, Minnesota attempted 18 Hucks on Saturday night. They completed 13 of them for 72%, and they just continued to win the field position battle throughout the game, I think, with that. Not only was it landing body blows to just be able to complete long passes in the wet conditions, but I think it also just allowed Minnesota to have the ability to set up even if they missed on their 5 attempts or on the 5 huck attempts that they had. I was just really impressed with the Wind Chill's ability to have a game plan for Colorado that they never really wavered from. Even as the Summit came back, I didn't have as much trepidation with Minnesota dealing with the Summit then as I did the night prior when Colorado was mounting its comeback against Madison.
Yeah, I mean, this was a much sloppier game. Obviously, there were nearly 40 turnovers, which is, hey, exactly what I said was going to happen because Seafoam Stadium does Seafoam Stadium things. And it's really wild in a game with 39 turnovers that both teams were so good hucking the disc in the elements. But what really let Colorado down, and I think this is just so indicative of like playing a really tough game the night before and being a little exhausted, is their D line just could not get on track with converting those break opportunities. Both teams had 12 break opportunities, and the big difference in this game is that Minnesota, they converted on half of them, and Colorado only converted on 2 out of 12 opportunities, and that's really the difference there. There's Colorado played a pretty good game. Atkins had almost 900 yards in this game combined, receiving and throwing. Just again putting a Herculean effort by him out there, and just played an amazing game. Noah Kuhlman also had a really good game against Minnesota, and they just couldn't quite put a full game together in either one of these. And credit to Minnesota, as you said, the deep shots were really working for them. And as you said, when they missed on their deep shots, they were always able to get their defense set up, and they were able to take advantage of a Colorado D-line that looked like they were a little tired and looked like they were a little out of sorts. Minnesota, the connection you mentioned also, like from Klain to Rader. I mean, you have Josh Klain, who wants nothing more than to be able to just throw a disc as far as he can, and you're pairing him with a guy who can essentially not be overthrown. It just seems like a match made in heaven.
Speaking of a match made in heaven, the complementary throwing work between Josh Klain and Will Brandt in Minnesota's backfield, I think, is going to spell a lot of success if they can continue to build it in their final 6 games of the season. I mean, I know they combined for 9 throwaways in this game. That's a little representative more of the conditions and Minnesota entrusting them to make hard decisions than I think it is that they have a problem with turnovers. Now, Klain, that might be more of a case, but Brandt committing 4 throwaways in this game is more representative, I think, of the kind of wetness that everyone was having to deal with.
Yeah.
But to that point, again, we talk about the Klain deep shots to Rader. The beginning of the game was established with Will Brandt and his breakthrows, especially within the red zone, getting some pretty crucial short field scoring opportunities punched in for Minnesota.
Yeah, Will Brandt has really developed his ability to take advantage of his length over the last couple of seasons. It wasn't something I thought he did very well early on in his Wind Chill career. But, he was a kid who came into the league like straight out of high school. So no shocker that he needed some time to kind of develop like ways to throw around like, bigger, more athletic defenders. And he's got it. I mean, he's one of those guys that's just so long and has learned to use his length so well that you almost feel a little bit powerless on the mark. Like it's less about like you can't really try to take away the inside break and the outside break because you're just not going to be able to stop either one of them. You just kind of have to commit to, all right, I'm really not going to let him throw around me. If he's going to break me, it's going to have to be, through the inside lane. Because if you try to hedge your bets and try to affect both of them, you're going to see a lot of what we saw in the highlight video that the league posted, which is him just getting whichever throw he wants, basically whatever one he sees fit as the best option, especially in the red zone in those tight areas. Like he's as good as probably anyone in the league at getting the throw he wants to those smaller spaces. And he does it so quickly that you really can't do much about it. and there just aren't going to be a lot of defenders that are tall enough and long enough to affect both sides of that. And you just saw that on display in this game.
So both Madison and Minnesota get wins against Colorado, which sets up their upcoming matchup in week 9 at Seafoam Stadium. That will be the second meeting between these two teams. Again, Winchell took it to Madison back in week 5, winning at Breese Stevens Field. So they could sweep the season series if they get a win this next Saturday at home. But Radicals really want this win. I think that in terms of a years-long context, this might be the most motivated Madison has been for particular matchups since, I don't know, maybe even 2018. Because I feel like it has an opportunism to it and an excitement to it that is a lot more titillating than what Madison often has to motivate itself with over the past few seasons, which is that we need this win in order to not fall out of contention. This win, if they get it, and if they get it by enough goals, could vault them into first place in the Central.
Yeah, pretty crazy when you think about it. In that context, they, I'm sure we'll talk about this heading, in our preview episode, but I do think they have a good chance. We'll wait and see what lineups. I think more so than any other season, the lineups have played so much into some of the results, especially in the Central, where I think teams are a little less deep past 20 and generally need all of their players available if possible. But yeah, I mean, if you would have told me this is where, now granted, again, the scheduling thing, like Madison had 4 wins against a Pittsburgh team who looked unprepared for the season and a Detroit team who hasn't won since before my child was born. But as you mentioned, it's like the confidence they've gotten from those allowed them to kind of go into this Colorado game and kind of punch Colorado in the face. And I wonder if they can kind of take the momentum from this game and try to go do something similar to Minnesota. Because, Minnesota wins this game. Yeah, it's like they look like the better team from start to finish. They still had 18 turnovers. And yeah, you can say weather, but at Seafoam Stadium, there's always weather. There's something that's going to affect the game. So I would imagine when Madison goes up there, there's going to be weather. And, both, it's going to come down to, as it always does up there, who handles the weather better. So I like Madison's chances. I think it'll be that'll be a fun game. Obviously, I'm in a situation where I'm playing every weekend now, so I don't get to watch everything live like I have several times throughout the season. But this will be one that I'll definitely want to go watch, start to finish, as soon as I can.
Well, we'll get more into the Madison and Minnesota matchup when we do our Week 9 preview pod in just a couple of days, but we should get to the rest of the Week 8 slate. I think most notably, I want to talk through the 3 big comeback wins for Pittsburgh, New York, and Detroit. Let's start on Friday night with the Thunderbirds in Chicago. They fall down 5-2, I believe, in that first quarter against Chicago, and then over the final 3 frames only allow the Union to score 7 total more goals. They hold Chicago to just 12 total, and Pittsburgh goes on to win 17-12. Like you said earlier in this episode, they've won 4 of 5. They have wins against Indy, Minnesota, and Chicago. They just need one against Madison to have kind of the full cycle against potential playoff teams in their division. It wasn't a clean victory by any stretch of the imagination for the Thunderbirds, but they're just getting it done. I don't know how else to really encapsulate what's been happening with this T-Birds crew other than they know the stakes and their matchups in any given game, and they seem to be better at being able to make adjustments mid-game and stick to what they're good at and simply out-persevere their opponents right now.
Yeah, it's very Oakland of them.
I like that comparison.
Yeah, I do want to make a small correction. You said that Detroit had a big comeback. You meant DC. I don't want anyone's hopes to get up that Detroit.
Oh, did I say Detroit? I meant DC.
Did.
Jeez.
I don't want anyone to think that the Alley Cats lost to Detroit this weekend, because that most certainly did not happen. I think we won by 12 or something. I don't know. A large number. So I had to clear the air first. I don't need.
No,
I don't need
please.
that
I need to be corrected. Maybe even put in front of a firing squad for making a comment like that.
So you mentioned this game not being the cleanest. Let's put a little context on it. 59 turnovers combined between the two teams, and of those 59, only 23 came from blocks. So we're looking at a lot of throwaways. It was a pretty windy game by the looks of it, but there were just a lot of uncharacteristic mistakes, I think, from both teams. Like, there were some drops, there were some kind of really silly throwing decisions. It's like almost as if the teams forgot sometimes that they were playing in heavy wind. Neither team was very good in the deep game, though both teams kept testing the deep game. A combined 29 hucks and only 10 completed. So it was a very weird game. But to your mention of like what happened after quarter one, Chicago scored 7 total goals in quarters 2 through 4, and they were without John Lithgow this weekend, and it looked like to kind of compare to last year's Chicago team that also struggled offensively. It looked like what happened last year is they had gone from having Ross Barker to not having Ross Barker. And what I mean by that is Ross Barker was the guy who like always got open. Like, you could always count on Ross Barker to be open somewhere for an easy completion. And Lithgow, I think, largely has kind of developed into that player for Chicago, where you might look at the goals and assist numbers, and you might not see his name really at the top of the charts for Chicago. But like, when you watch the game, you can just see the pressure that he relieves from everyone else. And it looked like they really missed that in this game. And Pittsburgh just took advantage of some like Chicago turnovers that happened like really early in the possession. Like, I think you mentioned that at one point, I think they had like 4 out of 5 Chicago points. Like, they turned it over before they made it to midfield. And that just makes it easy.
Before they completed their third pass, it often felt like.
Yeah, there was like back-to-back points where Wilson Matthews like dropped the disc, or maybe it was like 2 out of 3 points. And it was just like weird things like that happen. And Pittsburgh just kind of hopped on it every time and took advantage of it. I was really impressed by their patient counterattack, because their D-line, despite the low conversion percentages from both offenses, their D-line converted at 50% and was able to like kind of work the disc down the field to get those breaks in a lot of those cases. And
how about this for a turnaround? Pittsburgh in their first 2 games of the season, kind of connecting to your thoughts about them looking like Swiss cheese and not able to really convert any breaks. First 2 games of 2024, they were 3 of 16 on break opportunities against Minnesota and Madison.
Yep.
Past 2 games, they've got 20 break scores and are converting somewhere in the vicinity of 66% of their overall opportunities.
Yeah. The defense stepping up when they had kind of been absent in their first few games is what has really sparked this turnaround. Because you got to keep in mind, they're doing this without Max Shepard, and they've done it in a couple games without Carl Johnson. So like, 2 of their biggest offensive weapons not available, and the defense has really stepped up and started creating turnovers and converting breaks. So seems to be a recipe that's working for them, and we'll see moving forward if they can kind of continue to replicate this, because it seems to be a recipe that's yielding some success.
It's just such a weird endeavor to look at Pittsburgh's last 5 games. So they get a 1-goal win at Minnesota, absolutely disrupting the reigning division champions' home opener of the season. Then they go and they win against Detroit by 9 goals. No surprise there. Then they go to Toronto, lose by 8 against a 1-win Rush opponent up in Canada. Then the very next week, they bounce back, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to rub this in for you, but they play the most efficient offensive game in regular season history against the Alley Cats, win by 8, and then the following week, 2 weeks later, this past Friday, they go down 3 on the road to Chicago and look like they're going to have a long night against a tough Union defense. And while their offense never really got on track, they still get a going away 5-goal win against the team that is maybe most likely to compete against them for the third and final seed in the Central Division playoff race. I mean, it is just up, down, up, down, up, down. If any team, I guess, was going to make chaos into a ladder, it would be this T-Birds team.
Yeah, Chicago, they have 4 wins, but 2 of those are out of division, actually. They're Texas 2.
And what's tough is that one of them is against a very good opponent in Austin, ostensibly, and it just it's not going to factor into the Central Division playoff race much.
Yeah, we play them this weekend, and we already have the head-to-head. Should we go up there and beat them, that puts them in a really rough spot, because then they have to leapfrog us in the standings somehow, or find a way to get some success against Minnesota or Madison. But I mean, honestly, the playoff picture in the Central is so muddy that it's not even worth getting into it too much, because right now it kind of looks like it's coming down to the last week of the season, because there's just too many teams that have too many opportunities at this point.
Well, and just given the level of grudge matches and history to that division, I mean, Minnesota sits in 5-1, but Madison takes them out this coming weekend, and it feels like it might be a feeding frenzy for the rest of y'all and your potential hopes against the Wind Chill. But we'll get into all that later. I want to keep running down through the Week 8 slate of results, and I want to get to New York's skeleton roster big comeback win in Philadelphia. It looked like the Phoenix might finally get the feather in their cap and pull out a victory against either New York or DC, these kind of vaunted opponents that they've put right in the center of a bullseye target as far as reestablishing Philly's potential East Division competitiveness. And yet they just were not able to do any kind of closing out against the reigning champion Empire. It's still kind of a jambalaya of what to expect in the given rotations for New York, but they had Elliot Chartok, they had Charles Weinberg, they had Ethan Fortin, and you know what? They had Jack freaking Williams there to help really anchor the load. And I mean, to talk about that last player, you want to talk about a spark plug play. How about him getting a layout Callahan against Philly to really reignite this Empire team in their comeback?
It is wild, the absences New York had, and still how few times they turned the disc over. I mean, this was a game that featured 17 total turnovers, which is an insane number. 17 as an entire game just doesn't happen. Even for some context, I think the lowest, even indoors, I don't think we've had a game. I think our lowest turnover game combined ever was actually just a few weeks ago, where us and Chicago, I think, combined for 15 or 16. And they're doing it without Solomon Rushmire-Bailey, without Ben Yot. It's just this was the time Philly was supposed to beat New York. They were up 3 at halftime. Everything seemed to be going right, but as so many things have happened to Philly this year, even when they've looked right, they so quickly turn bad and go sour. And the fact that they were only able to force 7 total turnovers out of a New York team who was missing some of its core offensive identity for the last several seasons, it's one of those things where I want to put the blame on Philly, but I also want to give just so much credit to New York and how they were able to adapt to this new lineup that they threw out there. Moving Liam Haberfield back over to the O-line after he basically just hasn't been back there since the Atlanta game, and putting Ethan Fortin back in there. And, he had shown in a doubleheader weekend a few weekends ago that he was certainly capable of being back there and being effective. I just can't believe how efficient the offense was given the adjustments that they had to make.
You can't believe it. Come on. Discipline and sort of distilling back to the simplest principles, I feel like has been the bedrock of New York's successes. Again, we talk so much about the highlight plays and the stars and everything else. This is the kind of win that I think really gets at the core of what exists for the successes of New York's, I still want to use the D word, dynasty. With wins like this, when you have 7 total turnovers despite missing 10 starters across both lines, is so indicative of the culture and what is happening on kind of a meta level for New York, where what other team could really endure the kind of road trip hardships that New York did and come out with a win like that? I mean, we kind of saw it with Colorado. Colorado put up really good fights on the road, but they just couldn't quite get over the hump. And yet New York, they just march and march and march and get back and get the edge, and then they don't relinquish it to the Phoenix once they had it.
Yeah, I can't believe it. I'm just going to go ahead and say it. Because 7 is just that's an insane number for...
So, it's really star-crossed for Philly. Both games against New York, they've only been able to force 7 total turnovers from the Empire. So 14 total turnovers in 2 games against the reigning champs. You've got to figure out a better way to pressure them. And to the point that we've been talking to all season, this Philly defense, which really felt like coming out of last season was the most successful part about this Phoenix team, just cannot get stops when it matters. I'm thinking about there was that Huck look late in the game that Ethan Fortin had to Charles Weinberg that sort of tailed towards the sideline. And Weinberg's being pursued by 2 defenders, and somehow he gets it, basically tight-roping a sideline, and then it's just an easy 1-2-3 pass into the end zone from there. And that was the time in which Philly needed to stop. And last year, they were kind of able to do that. I mean, you think back to their win against Carolina, there was the Andres Rodriguez block in the 4th quarter in transition that sprung a huge outlet break score for Max Triflis going the opposite way. And this year, it's just, there's no real ability, especially in the second half, for them to pressure opposing offenses.
They've only forced 72 turnovers in 7 games. I mean, we're talking barely over 10 per game for 7-game sample size. To put it a little in context too, in Indy, we're second to last. We forced 83 turnovers in 1 less game, but 5 of our games have been indoors. Where obviously now, are we going to be at the top of the league if we're outdoors? No, we're not that team. But a team that plays indoors for 5 out of 6 games has forced more turnovers than Philly has right now. Their defense this is the most baffling thing about Philadelphia, because the thing that's always been the thing that's in flux for them, right? It's always been the offense. Like, what's the offense going to do tonight? Are they going to throw the disc away a lot? Are they going to choke it away in crucial moments? Or are they going to hold strong? Because we always felt like the defense was going to show up, and the defense is just non-existent this year. I don't know how you go from being such a high-ranking performer defensively and consistently, like for the last few seasons, to this. I don't know, because the personnel the roster itself has not changed all that much. Now they've shifted some personnel around, which I do think is part of the problem. I don't think they're putting their players in the best places for them to succeed as a team, and I think that is part of it. But for that to have this much of an effect is it seems to be beyond possibility almost. Credit to New York. I mean, they signed these guys off the street, and they must have made the right signings, because, as you mentioned, some of these guys, it's like we haven't heard from in the better part of half a decade, and here they are showing up, being effective. Like you said, distilling down to the simplest form of be disciplined, take the right looks, and things are going to work out in the end, and that's what happened.
Is Philly the death of defensive line efficiency being a real stat that we pay attention to? Because I'm looking at this. They're currently number 1 in the league in defensive success rate. 68%. They're converting on 68% of their defensive break chance opportunities. It would shatter the former single season record in this league. And yet, to your point, opponents are averaging just 10.7 turnovers per game against Philly. Detroit can't even approach that number. There's no one within 3 turns of them this season. The Nitro are second in fewest turnovers forced by an opponent, and they're at 13 a game. It's just wild kind of stats to look at for Philly. And on the flip side, again, you've got New York, who is discernibly a notch or 2 or 3 below where they've been the past few seasons, and yet there is a grittiness, there is a Jack Williams, Weinberg Chartockness to this team that you just can't really take them for granted in any given formation of their lineups.
Yeah, they find a way to get it done. And this is such a different season for them, right? Like we've gone over this all the time, but the way they have to win games too is just so different because it's not this. You're right. It's not like it was before. Like you could always count on these highlight plays in every game they played, and while they still have highlights here and there, it's just so much more about getting back down to basics. Like complete the next pass, keep the disc moving, make sure we're not putting it in harm's way, and just be efficient. And they're finding ways to do that even when they don't have their top team out there. And I think that's just because when that's what you distill down to, when you distill down to like, oh, we don't have to like take a ton of deep shots. We don't have to do anything other than just complete the next pass and make sure that we're throwing a pass that we're confident we're going to complete like 95+% of the time. When you distill it down to just that, like as long as you put capable throwers around each other and people who know what spaces to move into, you can switch people in and out like they've been doing. And even that game last week, like they were kind of had a skeleton crew against DC, and they made that a game despite the fact that they were on the road with not their top 20. So this New York team, it's so weird. I both feel like they can make a run and also don't have the confidence that they can do it just because it's just because I'm so used to them being dominant that when they're anything other than that, it just gives me pause. But they faced so much adversity this year already, and they feel like they're fighting through it as well, if not better than you even could have hoped for.
Yeah, I think that's a terrific point about kind of the bias and the lens in which we see this Empire team coming off of the sort of dominance that they had 2022 and 2023. We just have a level of expectation of them crushing opponents. And that's clearly not the case this year. They've got 3 losses, which is as many as they've had in numerous years. But they're doing it without people. I mean, they were basically missing almost their entire starting defense this past week. And yet they still were able to punch in 5 of 8 defensive break opportunities. I mean, that is the kind of not necessarily volume approach you would want from a defense as vaunted as New York, but they're getting it done when it matters. I think kind of the weirdness of this New York team can be summed up in a couple of ways. They had their highest offensive success rate this past weekend. 67% of their offensive possessions ended in a score. They were 15 to 16 inside the red zone, 94%, second highest rate of the season. Again, just down a ton of starters. But for the 7th time in 8 games and 7 straight games now, New York has registered 7 or fewer takeaways. There is just not the kind of pressure we're used to from this Empire defense or even from the offense when they make mistakes of being able to earn this disc back. And again, that comes with a huge caveat that they were down Antoine Davis, Breton Tan, Dross, everything this past weekend. But still, there's just there's an oddity to this Empire team, to your point of, I love the grittiness, man. Like, I agree with you. I think that they've overcome a tremendous amount of their adversity and show themselves as much as a competitor as any team in this league. But you look at sort of the stats and read between the lines a little bit, and there are some concerns. There are some very legitimate concerns.
The dynasty's not dead until it's dead, right? Like, I think that's just where we kind of have to go with this. Like,
yeah. You've gotta usurp the king, man.
It's like in a George R.R. Martin novel. If you don't see them actually die on screen or on the page, then they are not dead. And that's kind of how I feel about this New York Empire team until they are actually like the playoffs, basically set in the East in terms of the teams. Like with Montreal's loss this weekend, which I think we'll get to in a second. Like it's going to be New York, DC, and Boston, and it's almost certainly going to be Boston as the 1 seed. Until I see New York lose to DC or Boston in the playoffs, or I can't say that they're not going to just go to championship weekend and find a way to win another title, because it just seems like they find a way. Like that's what they've been doing this year. They find a way. So.
Well, now you're mixing media references for me, because that's Jurassic Park, man. But I was going to do the whole Greyjoy, what is dead can never die. And now we're in a total muddled metaphor place. But I want to talk about the DC at Montreal absolute pandemonium ending in the fourth quarter in that one. DC had a road trip in Canada this past weekend. They take care of business up in Toronto on Saturday, and then have their second game in Montreal on Sunday against a Royale team who has been playing every team close so far in 2024 after failing to win a game last season. And the Royale once again had a terrific opportunity at Claude Robillard in front of another huge crowd. They enter the fourth quarter down 1 to DC, and this is really hard to remember in retrospect. I actually had to remember this when I was going back through and just taking notes and watching the game again. I thought Montreal was surging more at that point, but DC had carved out their own 1-goal lead heading into the final frame, and yet Montreal started off the fourth by converting on 5 of 6 opportunities. They take a 20-17 lead at a certain point in the game, under 5 minutes to go, and then everything comes apart at the seams for the Royale. In fact, I would go so far to say, in terms of the final 5 minutes of the game, I've never quite seen a collapse quite like this. And, you can spin it either way. DC deserves all the credit in the world for sticking with it and keeping right on the heels and doing everything that they need to still be in this game. But when you allow 4 straight goals at home in the particular ways that it happened, it's just an absolute gut punch, leaving you in the rain to just figure it out on your own sort of result for Montreal, who, had they won it, would be sitting at 3-4 and are instead, they would have been at 3-3 had they pulled out that win, and are now at 2-4 and kind of all but eliminated from the East Division playoff race.
The only collapse I can think of that is in any way akin to this one. This is a fun one if you want to go and watch UFA TV and go find this game. Pittsburgh at Detroit in 2019, where I believe Pittsburgh was down 5 with 5 minutes left. And, well, we know how long the losing streak is, so you can do some simple math to figure out how that game ended. It was 4 minutes and 23 seconds left. I know because I took a screenshot of it. 4 minutes and 23 seconds left. Montreal's up 3. They're pulling to DC. And it was just kind of a comedy of errors, like the way things happened. I think the way that DC tied the game at 20, to me, was the most indicative of just how panicked Montreal had become as DC had closed the gap. And then the part that might be the craziest, right, is they're receiving the disc with the game tied and like 40 seconds left. They don't need to, you would like to score, but they turn it over almost immediately. It's just like, this is a team who hasn't won a lot of games recently, finding ways to lose games, right? There's like the old adage that, like, winners find ways to win games and losers find way to lose games. Like, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't know, that's essentially what the adage is. And this is what it looked like. It looked like a team who has won a lot of games found a way to win, and a team who has not won a lot of games did about everything that they possibly could to lose the game. And
it's the inverse of New York, right? That's why New York wins that game coming back, and this is why kind of Montreal coughs it up. DC is one of the most disciplined teams, and they're so good at just being able to kind of grind out possessions and manufacture things out of thin air that it was the sort of perfect foil to the Royals' inability to just contain their energy. I mean, I remember when they went up 20-17, they're bum rushing the field. They got a break score. It felt like this sort of breath of fresh air. They were going to get this win over a playoff team in what's felt like the first time in 5 years for the Royale, and it just could not hold.
The funny thing is, like, the first half of the fourth quarter, DC looked like they had no answer. They looked it looked like we were watching a different team. They were missing things on offense that they routinely hit. Couple of weird, like, almost catches where, like, ground contact ends up forcing, like, the disc to come out. They looked so out of sorts, but then when it came down to, like, the put up or shut up moment type, it's like that refocused them. And as you mentioned, it's like when they were down 20-17, after looking so bad on offense for the whole fourth quarter, they just locked in, and it's like they just went right back to the same DC Breeze team that we've seen for a few seasons now, where they just were very no nonsense, getting up the field, making all the right throws, not giving the defense a chance to affect anything. And that was all they needed to, carry them through the rest of the game. So, Montreal, like, I do want to give them credit, right? Like, they clearly continue to show a lot of growth from last year. They're just not quite to the point yet where they're going to be able to win games like this consistently. They got to figure out ways to do it.
And they were without Tobe DeCrane, who was off at Windmill as well as a part of the Tokay All-Star team. And so Montreal was without their leading scorer from this season, the rookie sensation out of Belgium. And so definitely that was a major factor. But I want to give two big flowers, one to Lauren Boyle and the DC coaching staff for keeping their heads in those final few points. They made some terrific adjustments. You talk about how at the beginning of the fourth quarter, DC's offense looked out of sorts. One of the final possessions ended with Charlie McCutcheon subbing on offense, which is one of the first times in his several years career in this league that I remember him being on a offensive point like that. And yet he got the goal in a very crucial late game moment. And then also for Boyle and the coaching staff's ability to pocket one of the timeouts so that they could utilize it during that 4-goal run to close out the game. And then for Montreal, and this is obvious if you've been following along with any of the league's social media whatsoever, Kevin Quinlan becomes the second player in UFA history to have 400 career assists, joining Pavel Giannis. Quinlan has been playing in this league since its advent. He originally got started with the Buffalo Hunters, RIP, now defunct. He played with the Rochester Dragons, RIP, now defunct. And yet he's found a home the past 9 years now with Montreal. He's been one of the greatest throwers in this league's history, and just a really deserved moment for one of the most committed professionals this league and the sport has ever seen in Quinlan.
Yeah, that game when we played Buffalo in 2012 was the only time.
When we played Buffalo in 2012.
Yep.
Holy cow, I did not expect that sentence.
That's the only time our teams have faced off against each other. We're the only two guys who have played in every season, and that's the only time that we've ever, had our teams play against each other. You'll excuse me if I don't remember or know if he played in that game, because at the time the focus was on here's a name for you, Rob Dulabon, more than it was on Kevin Quinlan. So.
Oh yeah, Rob Dulabon. He last played for the Thunderbirds. We should do like a naming guys episode at some point in the off season when we have time. I'm sure you and I could really go tit for tat on that one. But so we've kind of talked about what we wanted to as far as the particular games and matchups in Week 8. We're already an hour into this episode. I wanted to kind of get to some more larger picture stuff, but first and foremost, I just wanted to get a brief playoff picture in people's heads. So I'm going to run through each division and talk about each of the top 3 teams very briefly. And essentially, you've got 5-1 Madison in first, followed by 5-2. I immediately messed that up. In the Central Division, you've got 5-1 Minnesota, 5-2 Madison following them in second place, and then 4-3 Pittsburgh, slightly edging out 4-3 Chicago due to their most recent head-to-head victory. Those would be the prospective 3 playoff teams in the Central: Minnesota, Madison, and Pittsburgh. In the East, you've got the 3 sort of titans in DC, Boston, and New York. In the South, you've got the 3 teams that we all knew going into the season would clinch those 3 bids in Carolina, Atlanta, and Austin again, and maybe a slightly varied ordering than what we might have prognosticated heading into the season, but I don't think anything approaching a kind of surprising per se, right? And then in the West, you've got 6-1 Salt Lake, 7-2 Seattle, and as you say, 1 win away from clinching their first playoff appearance since, I believe, 2016. I have to go back and verify that, but it's been a while for the Scades. And then 4-2 Oakland, another team who has had multiple seasons away from the playoffs. So a lot of newcomers into the playoff competitive format right now. The question I ask you is, do you think the current standings will hold and that these will be the 12 teams representing their respective divisions in the 2024 UFA playoffs? Or given how this season has gone and given our inability to really tell what is coming next, do you think we've still got some more chaos to experience?
So in the South and the East, I'm going to say no chaos. Those are the 6 playoff teams, I think.
Yeah, okay, fine. That's boring. Yeah. Whatever.
I think if you ask anyone, that's probably... in the West, I do think it's going to be Salt Lake, Seattle, and Oakland, although San Diego might have something to say about that. They do have 3 matchups with Oakland remaining.
That's what I really wanted to kind of angle at, is this West Division scheduling quirk that we have, where in the final 5 weeks of the season, Oakland and San Diego, the 2 teams closest battling for the 3rd and final playoff spot in the West Division, will have 3 matchups with each other. Oakland is at 4-2, San Diego is at 3-4. And as we kind of talked about heading into this episode, the Growlers might be a game behind Oakland, but they've looked like one of the most competitive groups in the West Division throughout the season. They gave Salt Lake 2 of their closest tests, other than what Colorado accomplished in Week 7, getting the win in Zions Bank Stadium. The Growlers played really, really well against the defending divisional champs, the Shred. And so they kind of figured to have a lot of confidence going against an Oakland team that has proven itself able to win in high octane, big emotion environments. But given how they ended the 2023 season, being 7-3 entering the final weekend of the regular season, dropping both their games and failing out of the playoffs entirely, this feels a little too similar for me to be comfortable in just rallying behind the Spiders. As much as I enjoy watching them, and as much as I agree with head coach Dan Silverstein saying you'd be stupid to not tune in and watch this team in any given game, I just feel like Oakland is in a star-crossed situation where they are setting themselves up to be in a very similar situation to 2023.
Yeah. And to be clear, like out West, 8 wins right now will guarantee you a playoff spot. And Salt Lake has, they have 5 games left. They just need to win 2 of them to even wrap up. And I think we feel comfortable saying Salt Lake is going to make the playoffs. Seattle's got another game against Portland. They just handled pretty easily this weekend. So even if they drop their games against Salt Lake and Colorado, a win to Portland in the last week would guarantee a playoff spot. It's really going to come down to Oakland and San Diego. I like Oakland's chances. They have a favorable schedule. They would really just need to win some games against an LA team that really seems to be reeling since Van Dusen went down, and they look to largely be pretty non-competitive at this point. And as far as with the playoff teams, I think. But yeah, those 3 matchups that San Diego and Oakland have, like especially if San Diego takes the first matchup, I really wonder how Oakland responds to that. Like, do they tighten up, especially the players who lived through that pain last year of getting knocked out by San Diego at the end of the year? Like, they're gonna have a little flashback to losing both games the last week of the season to miss the playoffs? But I do like Oakland's chances. I think this team they seem to be playing with a lot of confidence, and they seem to feel like they can really take it to anyone on any given day. And they're not wrong. I think they can. They outside of their Salt Lake game, which wasn't super close. I mean, they've had good games with Seattle. In fact, and beat Seattle in one of those games. They found a way to beat Colorado, which, like, for all of Colorado's struggles, they've looked much better with Nethercutt in the lineup, and he was in the lineup for that game. That's definitely the most intriguing. Like, just like looking at two teams and who's going to make it is the fact that they have 3 games against each other. Yeah, you couldn't write it up any better.
And you know who else is really paying attention to those matchups? Colorado, because as we've lamented, they're on the absolute outs. They're a little bit underwater. They need a lot of help. But if the Growlers can take at least 2, if not all 3 of the matchups with the Spiders, they will kind of unexpectedly be resuscitating the Summit team's possible playoff push, because the Summit hosts San Diego this Friday, and then the Growlers have to go the next night and face Oakland on Saturday. That will be a big part of whether San Diego stays anywhere within the vicinity of making the 3rd seed in the West. But Colorado, if they win that game, and then if San Diego goes on and wins on Saturday night in Oakland, they'll be on life support, but they'll be still in the playoff picture. And I think the Summit, to what we've kind of been talking about, are one of those teams that nobody really wants to see still alive as we work towards the postseason.
Especially if they ever get to the point where they have Quinn Finer back. Like, that's the thing, right? Like, they offensively, like, they are 0-3 in games without Nethercutt, and they haven't even had Quinn Finer yet. And if they are able to get him back later in the season and still have a chance at the playoffs, I mean, that could be something. But to put in perspective how unlikely it is for Colorado to make the playoffs, they have to essentially win out. They have to finish 7-5, and they can't tie Oakland in record because Oakland has already secured the head-to-head advantage. And they also have to make sure that San Diego that San Diego doesn't go out and somehow manage 7 wins and win a tiebreaker scenario somehow. Although I think that would be impossible. So it's like Colorado needs so much help, but there is a chance. There is a chance. And until they lose another game or until Oakland gets to 7 wins, there will still be a chance for the Summit, I think. And I don't want to get into the minutia of the Central because we would have to go through 5,000 different scenarios of what could happen.
Oh, I hate going through the tiebreaker stuff, man. Yeah, I really just need that sort of results to just happen before my brain can really sink into it.
The big thing you need to know right now is that there are 5 teams in the Central that all are very much alive and all very much control their own destiny for making the playoffs. So, like, it's way too muddled. We're still sitting at only, there's 2 teams ahead of us at 4-3. Well, we've only played 6 games so far. And so there's way too many things to go to. Like, yeah, Madison's at 5-2, but they still have, 2 games against Indy, a game against Chicago, I think, and a game against Minnesota, a game against Pittsburgh. So, like, all of these potential playoff teams, we're all going to be playing each other. The only matchup I think that doesn't happen anymore this season is there are no more Alley Cats win show matchups. But outside of that, every one of those 5 teams will play every other team that is going for a playoff spot. So we probably won't see any clarity to this picture for at least 2 or 3 weeks. And it probably won't be until the last week or 2 of the season that we could maybe even narrow it down to 4 teams going for those 3 spots. So if you're looking for a lot of chaos, the Central is where it's at, because your guess is as good as mine as to not only who will make the playoffs, but where each team even ends up seated in the playoffs. As much as I want to say, like, Minnesota looks like the clear favorite to take the 1 seed, they still have to play Chicago 2 more times. They still have to play Madison another time. They have a game against New York, who's coming into town. So, like, I want to say that they're going to end up being first, but those are all losable games. I think Minnesota's a great team and could easily go and win in any or all of those games, but those teams aren't going to go away easy. So I don't know. You could draw up any number of playoff pictures for the Central, and I don't think you could definitively say any of them would be wrong.
I'm using a pencil when we're doing playoff pictures. I'm not using pen or Sharpie or anything. And I wanted to kind of build off of what you said about Colorado. There's a chance. And that's all that matters right now in the 2024 season, that there's a chance. Because again, it's just chaos mode out here, man. We didn't even get to talk about one of the bigger storylines in the season, which is that comebacks are the new meta. I mean, you talk about the amount of teams this season who have engineered big time comebacks for very crucial wins. We're 2 years removed from play testing a bunch of comeback mechanics in the All-Star game that you yourself were a part of, which included reduced stall count, backcourt violation, and a 2-pointer. Yet apparently really all it took was new pulling rules and a little bit of more offensive instability, and we've got a situation rife for teams being able to just pull back from seemingly insurmountable deficits. But that will do it for this episode of Swing Pass and the Week 8 recap. We will be back with you in just a day or two to preview what figures to be a monumental Week 9 lineup of games. There's not a Super Series game coming up this weekend. That will have to be delayed for another 12 days as we still prepare for a rematch of the 2023 championship game between Salt Lake in New York in Connecticut in a very special venue of an MLS team. We'll obviously preview that as it comes available. Getting a little too far ahead of myself. Again, that will do it for this episode. Cam and I will talk to you very soon. Bye now.